All right. I forgot to set up screen share. Here we go. Present to everyone. All right. Uh-oh. That was from last one. Office hours. Hey, teacher. Hey, teacher. Okay, let's do a lecture. Well, not really a lecture. We're going to take the key concepts, which are really slides I use in class, but I actually developed specifically for the online classes to be used as key concepts study guide, sort of, for the quiz. Basically, the chapters for Give Me Liberty, which, by the way, I'm sorry if there's I'm not sure if I've had you guys look at any documents for this class where the documents aren't in the chapter. I went through and basically I got a PDF version of this textbook, which students had to purchase for the first few years I taught. But the textbooks are really expensive, and school bookstores are criminals. So some student found the whole PDF version of this book, sent it to me, and I decided, hey, let's break it down chapter by chapter. It's a very wordy book, so I started, editing it to make it a little shorter for you guys because I care, and may have at times taken parts out I didn't need, but the assignments that are still on the class website, like say, hey, look at the. Anyways, long story short. Also, the page numbers on these key concepts, the page numbers for every key concepts slide collection, is based off of the actual edition, Siegel 3rd edition of Give Me Liberty, Volume 1, listed on the syllabus, which is not the same as the PDF version that we use in the class, because I wrote the slides before I got this version, and then I got this version, and I'm sharing it, and I'm even shortening it a bit, and it's free, so that's wonderful. Just so happens, though, the page numbers might be a little off. But don't go by that. Go by everything else. Usually you can look at the index, or if something like indentured servant is mentioned, and you can't find it, go to the index in the back. It'll tell you what page number it's on. I forgot. We're using a PDF version, so there is no index. I feel like an idiot now. Okay. I have no idea how to clarify that one, so just forget it. And I'm rambling. Chapter 4. Let's do this. I've never done this. No, I have done this before, but it's been a while. So. Wait. Let's go to full. No, let's just do this. This is fine. So let's actually back it up a bit, in case you don't realize it, which you should probably. I'm imagining all of you do. We're going to use the Canvas situation here. My Gavlin folks, I didn't open up an iLearn page before this, so I'm not going to take up time doing it. But you understand. It's the same concept. Here's the page. Here's the page for at Evergreen History 17A, at Gavlin it's History 1. Same concept. You scroll down to this, whatever week it is. Here we go. This is for the upcoming week. You will have quiz number 3 based on chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 key concepts are up here because, I want you to, it looks better to break it up, but also just, get one chapter of reading a week. Chapter 4 is down here. So let's look at chapter 4. This is a fun one because there's actually a big war at the end, which in many ways a lot of folks think sets up the revolution to a certain extent. And it's also arguably a world war because it's fought on multiple continents. We don't call it a world war, though, because we don't start calling things world wars until the 20th century. And even then, the first World War wasn't really called World War I until the second one, right? You know what I'm saying? Usually that's how it works. Spider-Man is just Spider-Man. It's not Spider-Man 1. Godfather. The only thing I can think of is Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, right? That's the first one, because he knew there were 3 other episodes before that, so George Lucas, So, this chapter ends with a global conflict that has serious ramifications for the future of British North America. But a very important part of this chapter deals with the not origins of slavery, obviously, because slavery is introduced in Chapter 1, obviously, as far as the enslavement of indigenous Americans, and then also the introduction of slavery from Africa by Portuguese slave traders and other things. But it really sets up the codification, or the I'm trying to think of the word for it, and I can't. I'm drawing a blank. Entrenchment of slavery as a very, very dominant labor force in the southern colonies of British North America, right? And now, so the means with which slaves came from Africa, right? The transatlantic trade, or the Atlantic trade, they're referred to differently. For example, later on, Foner, the author of this textbook, will refer to the Mexican-American War as the Mexican War. Of course, when I learned about it in high school, it was the Mexican-American War. But he uses the Mexican War. I'm not sure if there's still people that call it different things there. We have the Atlantic trade, right? Trade across the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean should not be seen as a barrier necessarily, right? It's the real barrier. Once you get to Virginia, once you get to Massachusetts, getting to California, getting across the land of this continent, that takes a really long time. That's very dangerous. I mean, about the Donner Party, and they were almost in California. They were actually in the Sierras. It gets a little crazy. You're going over mountains, you're going over all sorts of stuff. Once people realize what's over here and people start doing it, traveling back and forth, it's been argued that the Atlantic Ocean is really just a series of highways, right? Boats are going through, lots of goods and services moving, lots of raw material from the New World, the Western Hemisphere, going back to Europe, lots of products in Europe, tea, clothing, other things, coming to the Americas, coming to America with, Arsenio Hall and Eddie Murphy. Kidding. Actually, that's probably insensitive because I'm about to talk about slavery, and I just referenced Eddie Murphy, who was not a slave, but he is. I'm not going to go there. Just ignore that part. It was incidental. Just the fact that I recognize it could be offensive shows what a wonderful guy I am, okay? Just kidding. Humility. Have humility. Between 1492 and 1820, this middle passage, which is the leg of a triangular trade. It's called the triangular trade. If you actually look, there should be a map in the book, or you can just Google search a map. Don't look for one that's just a triangle, a simple one. It was actually very elaborate. You have all sorts of goods coming from various parts of the Americas to various parts of Europe, things going to Africa, West Africa, different points, and then coming back to the West Indies, Brazil. It was much more elaborate than a simple triangle, but there is, I have my phone ringing right now. It's a 1-800 number, but it looks vaguely familiar. It's probably my bookie. I'm just kidding. I'm not a gambler. So, the middle passage is the leg of these various trade routes that brought Africans to the Americas, that brought slaves to the Americas. Of course, they weren't slaves. They were Africans who were captured after a conflict with other nations and tribes and groups in Africa and sold to slave traders, or they were captured directly by slave traders for various reasons. So they were Africans, and slavery did exist in Africa. Slavery has existed throughout the human history. It's in the Bible, right? If you look at the story of Abraham, he owned slaves. He actually had a slave who bore one of his children, right? At least according to the Bible, right? Which is not a book of historical record, but it is a book of historical relevance, arguably, right? There's a difference. So, free people who are captured and as prisoners of war or for other reasons and are sold to slave traders and then brought across the Middle Passage to the New World. Some people commented on the a difference between indentured servants and slaves in some of the writing assignments. Indentured servants actually sign a contract and are brought over as a passenger, right? Because you're paying you're paying for their ticket, basically. You're giving them a seat on this boat, or you're giving them a place as a passenger. So they're a passenger, and it'd be nice if they were alive when they got here and relatively healthy, so that you could just get rid of that contract and sell it to somebody. Slaves, however, are human cargo. They are not passengers, right? They are cargo. Therefore, they are like sugar or tea. They're not like that in reality to you and me because they're people, but from the perspective of these people on these ships running them and actually transporting stuff, they are seen as cargo, right? And therefore, they are treated in one of the grossest and most inhumane ways you can conceive of in human history. So they are packed into the bottom of a ship. The idea being, pack them all in. You just, they're captured. You trade some rifles or some textiles or some whatever. You purchase them outright, and you just get a bunch of these prisoners of war, basically from some tribe, some African nation. They conquer a neighboring group. They grab people and sell them so they can get more weapons and continue to fight and be a more dominant group in the region, right? So this happened, and they were packed into these ships to the point where between 1492 and 1820, it was estimated that 7.7 million Africans survived being transported to the New World. That means that, and this is the low estimate. The estimate that Foner uses, Eric Foner, the author of the book, this is actually an extremely conservative estimate by other standards. Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary, who I'm not sure if she's still at Portland State, she wrote a wonderful book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. She puts it at around 10 to 15 million. So anywhere from 50% more than this number of 7.7 million to double it. I've heard numbers as high as 20 or 30. I'm not sure. There's ship logs. There's ways to get relatively accurate numbers. I believe that this one, I would say, is just a low estimate. 10 to 15 million that I mentioned is probably in the middle, and then there's some really high estimates that you have to really look at the source, because you might go on a website and it'll say 500 million people. It'll be this hugely grotesquely exaggerated number, and then you look at the website and it's from like a group that may have reasons to exaggerate it, maybe more aggressively condemning the slave trade at the expense of historical accuracy. Like for maybe some chapter of the Nation of Islam or something. Not to condemn Islam or the Nation of Islam, considering that Malcolm X was a member of it for a long time. I'm just saying, possibly, kind of like a white supremacist group that tries to say that this Civil War was about states' rights. When in actuality it was about states keeping slaves. You know what I'm saying? So 7.7 million survived. It is estimated that as many as an equal number died. Whether you're looking at the 7.7 million or 10 million, it's argued that 50% made it, 50% died, right? So you have to imagine you have a boat with 300 slaves underneath it, and you get to America, and 150 of them are dead. But it's not as if they all just die once you hit the coast. So you're chained to a boat. You're one on top of another. You're stacked with about maybe 18 inches of space. You have people who are vomiting, who are defecating, urinating, menstruating, giving birth, and people who are dying. You have disease outbreaks. This is very vile conditions happening. This is probably, arguably, one of the grossest crimes ever committed against another group of human beings, ever. And it's something that we've never really had a detailed, honest conversation about as a country. So it's healthy for us to discuss these things and to discuss them in detail, right? It's nice to have an objective view of things and to pull back from the emotional elements of it, but there's also an essential need, I feel, to look at what the actual experience on the ship was like and how grotesque it was and how terrifying it must have been. We know how the story ends, right? Black people are brought here and they become slaves. And we're still sort of struggling with issues of equality that stem from this original thing. It's referred to as an original sin, but I'm pretty sure that, the coughing on your hand and shaking the hands with an Indian and then watching them die off, is also a sin and happened first, arguably. That was a little blunt. For example, there were outbreaks of smallpox on ships, and they would the crew, these guys here, many of these guys here, this guy here, they would basically abandon ship, get in their boats, little smaller boats, and abandon the ship because there was an outbreak of smallpox. However, they would leave their cargo on the bottom of the ship, human cargo. So you have people who are chained in the bottom of the ship, floating around, covered in all sorts of God knows what. You know what? I mean, urine, menstruation, menstrual cycle, defecation, if that's even a word. People who are dying, people who've already been dead, watching others around them screaming and dying. And imagine if somebody was pregnant and gave birth in that situation, and there's a baby there, and that baby's just sort of sitting and hasn't been cleaned off, the umbilical cord hasn't been cut, and it's gonna eventually just, if it's alive, you know what I'm saying? I shouldn't get into more detail, but that's something that happened. That's something that really happened. And this number goes until 1820, which is when the United States actually exists. The United States has a legal Atlantic slave trade until 1808. So that's 32 years after the Declaration of Independence that stuff like that happened. And it continued to happen with smugglers. So the idea of African Americans, right? We have people from Africa. There's millions who make it here. Most of those 7.7 million, I'm going by that number because it's what's in the book, but I would argue I'm comfortable with saying that it's one of the lower estimates. 10 million would be a nice round number to go with. So, but I'm not an expert on that actual process of establishing that number. So let's go with what the book says, because it's millions of people. That's 7.7 million. Most of them do not come to British North America, Virginia, South Carolina. Most of them, if we're going to choose one spot, are in Brazil. Most of them end up in Brazil. You have sugar plantations, which are very labor intensive and have a high mortality rate, and have a huge demand for slaves. And there are plantations that are going to be in Brazil that have massive amounts of slaves that dwarf what Washington and Jefferson had here. And to this day, Brazil has the second largest black population in the world, outside of, I believe, Ethiopia or Nigeria. I'm not sure. But it actually has more black people than pretty much every country in the world, including every country in Africa, save one. And that's in sheer numbers. There's like 200 million Brazilians. And, yeah. Of course, there's also a lot more fluidity among races, ethnicities in Brazil, whereas we have, even if you're a light-skinned black person, you're half white or you're 75% white, theoretically, you usually identify as black. And there's a long story justification for that. Not justification, but there's a lot of reasons behind that that I'm not going to get into here. So there's a one-drop theory and various status things. There's discussed in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 a little bit, I think. So the idea of becoming African American is not something I really focus on until Chapter 11, primarily because you have obviously folks being brought here from a place where they were free, where they had their own language, where they had their own culture. Many of them were Islamic. It's estimated about 20% of the slaves brought to this country were Islamic, which is an interesting thing to wrap your head around, because if you think about it, there were, with that number, 20%, arguably out of the slaves that built the capital of this country, out of the slaves that built Washington, D.C., 1 in 5 of them working on the White House, on the Capitol, on whatever, were Islamic, were Muslim, right? So that's an important thing to think about as far as our perceptions of Islam and our perceptions of slavery and everything, because we think of when you think of the Capitol and important buildings in this country and Islam, a lot of people might think of just crashing planes into them and destroying them, right? Because of a few people from Saudi Arabia. But actually, there were very likely slaves that helped build this nation's capital, and they weren't paid for it, and they were being treated very poorly. So Interesting concept. But because of this heavy importation, considering the fact that slavery is still legal, even though there are people coming here and then there are people who get pregnant and give birth, and there are people being born in America, and we would call African American. They're born into this society where they are slaves, where they're in an English-speaking, predominantly Christian society like South Carolina or Virginia. There's still heavy importation. There are people who are coming from Africa who know what freedom is, who know what their roots are, right? They were just there in their lifetime. Now, references to going back to Africa, you hear in reggae music or various places, is really more of a spiritual concept because there's really no linkage that a lot of people have. Primarily because, like, even though the number of slaves is documented throughout ship logs, captain's logs, and whatnot. Not the names of people, because they were cargo. They weren't people, right? This isn't Ellis Island where immigrants are entering the country. They're not immigrants. They're being brought in as human cargo. So the number's there, but the names are not. So people have no idea, when their ancestors got here and how they got here and where they were from necessarily. That's why the book Roots by Alex Haley is such a fundamentally important and recognized achievement, because this is a guy who traced his origins back to slavery and back to Africa. Now we have these genealogy tests where it's like kind of, but this guy actually traced his specific lineage. So race is a social distinction. This ties it. Race is a social distinction. The idea of white supremacy, of race, is a social construct. It doesn't exist from a scientific perspective. There are different ethnic groups, but there are not different races. This is something that develops, and when you think of race and racism in America, what we're talking about usually is white supremacy. Does that mean that people who are black are not racist? No. There are black people who are racist. There are Asian people who are racist. There are Latinos who are racist, and Chicano people who are racists, right? But white supremacy, because if you look at this specific issue, the slaves are black. Most of the people who own slaves are white people, are very wealthy white people, and sort of fabricate this idea that people from Europe, people who descend from Europe, are just superior. Their religion, their language, everything about their society. And these folks from Africa are savages. They are just uncivilized. And therefore, we should not look at ourselves as monsters for enslaving them and raping them and physically abusing them. And not to mention not paying them and taking them from their homes permanently. But we should feel like we're doing a good thing. We're bringing them into a Christian civilized society, and we're giving them some sort of order in their lives, whereas before they were savages living in chaos or something, right? It's a total crock of shit, pardon my language. But that happens because slavery becomes this dominant labor force in the South, and takes over indentured servitude. Indentured servants and slaves, there used to be more indentured servants than slaves in the South. They'd work side by side. There wasn't really a distinction in race. I mean, obviously they knew they were different, but not in the same way. But eventually, indentured servants start to live longer, and they start to live out their contracts. More and more of them want their freedom dues, a piece of land, some money. And now there's more and more free people trying to go around, buy up land, and arguing for the right to vote and whatnot. And these are poor whites, right? So it makes more sense for wealthy planters to begin, whereas before, it didn't make as much sense to just pay $1,000 for a slave and own them for life. Why? That slave might die in 2 years. I can just buy this cheap indenture contract, and this guy's going to die before his contract's up, and I'll have spent much less money. But now they're living out their contracts. So it makes more sense to buy a slave and own them for life. Also, then the laws are written in ways where the children of those slaves are yours for life. There's a law in 1662 in the Virginia House of Burgesses that says that the status of any mother, the status of any child, born in Virginia, is based on the status of the mother. Which means that if the mother is a slave, the child is a slave. If the mother is free, the child is free. If the mother is white, the child is white. You know what I'm saying? Therefore, there's a reason for this. One is because obviously, I mean, you know, people might say because the mother is pregnant with the child for a long time, there's some sort of it's a easier thing to identify, right? Whereas a father can have sex with the mother and then split, not even be in the picture before the child's born. Also, but the main thing that it's argued for this law in 1662 is so that white male slave owners can procreate with their female slaves. And the children that are produced by that are half white. They are, in fact, half white, and their biological father is a slave owner, a wealthy, prominent white slave owner. They themselves are slaves for life. And I say procreate, usually this took the form of rape. And this is a complicated concept because even if there was some level of consent, even if it was a quote-unquote nice or benevolent slave owner, and they got some sort of permission from their female slave, like a yes, right? She's still your property, your human property. So how do we that yes? It's that the idea of coercion, right? The idea of force is very much ever present. So the idea, this is a situation where two people are not entering a situation of intimacy as equals. So whether you get a yes or a no or nothing is really it makes it very hard for me, at least, not to refer to it as some form of rape or coercive sexual interaction, right? Even Thomas Jefferson, who maybe had a very affectionate relationship with one of his slaves and in his own way thought that he cared about her, he still believed that black people were inferior, and he was still very privileged and wealthy and powerful, and he still owned the person that he had a relationship with, right? It's, you know, so even if a slave fell in love with her master, which I'm sure happened in time, maybe there were really loving relationships, but the relationship is predicated on the fact that she cannot leave, right? Her ancestors or her were kidnapped, brought to a continent where they did not want to go, or forced into a system of labor that's very abusive. If they try to run away, they are caught, and that's the world that you are brought into, and it's very limited. And who knows, you know, what events led up to you saying yes to this person, if you